I'd like to first of all acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to the elders past and present of the land we're meeting on. This is a part of Sydney with an absolutely beautiful and rich Aboriginal heritage, which I know many of you are aware of and work to protect from the threats of development. But you are privileged to share this part of Sydney with our First People. We're all privileged to share this with our First Peoples, and we should show them far more respect than we do in our planning and other government decisions. So, there's so much you can talk about when it comes to what's going wrong with planning and community engagement and local government in New South Wales. So it was really a question of, in my office, we were thinking, well, where do we start and end with a short presentation to Pittwater about what's going wrong with New South Wales? But I'd like to first of all start with what's going right with Pittwater. And what's going right with Pittwater is what you collectively have brought to this magical part of Sydney over the last decades and decades and decades, where you have protected your patch. And you can do something as simple as get a satellite view of Sydney and just narrow down a bit and have a look at the northern suburbs of Sydney and have a look at the tree canopy that covers northern Sydney. And there are few, if any, parts of Sydney, urban Sydney, that have a tree canopy anything like Pittwater. It really is a tribute to the culture and the resilience and the tenacity of your former council and the culture that was on that council of protecting trees. But that council got that culture because you as a collective group of residents demanded that they stand up for your environmental values. You've protected your foreshores, you've protected your coastal reserves, and you've also protected the native vegetation on so much land that is privately owned in Pittwater. And it's a tribute to you. It's a tribute to generations, I think, of environmental and community-minded campaigners that Pittwater is as beautiful and protected as it is. And tonight, when I sit here and I hear 4 strong, impassioned community campaigners who are concerned about your local shopping areas, your hospitals, your public transport links, the future of development in the area. Again, I want to talk about what's going right in Pittwater and what's going right in the Northern Beaches. And what's going right is not your state government, but you collectively. And as a Greens MP, with a fundamental belief in grassroots politics and empowering local people to protect their patch, I think the finest resource we have in Pittwater is you. And you're proving it again tonight by the numbers that have come out here tonight to protect your local patch. So congratulations to all of you. But against that resilience and that history, there are a whole bunch of forces that have been lined up against you, mainly at the direction of your state government. And the first one I point to is the Greater Sydney Commission. Each of the issues that were discussed, the public transport and the B-line, the overdevelopment in Mona Vale and Ingleside, and I put to that as well as the overdevelopment in Warriewood and other parts in the area, the disempowering of your local council, all of that really is exemplified by the Greater Sydney Commission. I mean, who here really knows what the Greater Sydney Commission's job is? Who can name the Greater Sydney Commissioner for the Northern Districts? For the North?
Deborah Deary.
Oh, there's one person who's met her and had a conversation. There's 6 people, 7. Where does she live? If you don't like what she does, can you throw her out of office? Can you elect one you like? The answer to all of that is no. When the Greater Sydney Commission Bill went through the New South Wales Parliament, I, on behalf of the Greens, moved an amendment that required the Greater Sydney Commissioner for a district to meet with the local councils and consult with the community a minimum 2 times a year. That was our amendment. Not what I call earth-shattering, but it required the Greater Sydney Commissioner to meet with the local councils and the community in a public forum twice a year. And the government rejected it because it would get in the way of the efficient operation of the Greater Sydney Commission. You, collectively, get in the way of the efficient operation of the Greater Sydney Commission. I mean, that for me summed up their approach. This is an organisation headed by Lucy Turnbull. I understand she's quite well connected in the Liberal Party. And again, she is the central driving force of a planning body that is, as we speak, drawing lines on the map and rewriting Sydney. And none of us, none of you, have any say in it at all. The Greater Sydney Commission wants to put the additional 13,500 housing units, residents in your part of the Northern District plan. 13,500. And what they simply say is, oh, well, there'll need to be some public transport to deliver it, and we probably should retain some of the natural values. But there are no provisions in the draft district plans that are now out, and which your council, on your behalf, has made a submission on. Did anyone get asked about that, by the way? No. Yeah, individual members have put submissions in, but your collective representation through the council have put a submission in, and none of you have been involved in that, I assume. The Greater Sydney Commission talks about the North Zone. That's lovely, the Northern District, and they say the Northern District of Sydney is an area rich in environmental value with many national parks and nature reserves. Planning for the region must preserve and enhance these values. Now, doesn't that sound lovely? And they also say that we should take into account climate change. They also say that we should take into account green corridors. And they also say that we should be protecting the tree canopy. But you know, there is not a single proposed mechanism to deliver on any one of those four goals. Nothing. They are empty statements to make us feel like our collective interests are being looked after. There's no money or requirement that public transport be delivered before development is produced. There are no mechanisms to maintain the tree canopy. And indeed, their overall goals for development in the area will destroy many of the natural and social amenities that they have in mind. And I think what really frustrates me as a Greens MP, who has a fundamental belief in public transport, whether it's light rail or heavy rail or well-organised bus links, all of that would be great for our city. But the only time this government proposes any change to public transport, whether it's the B line up here or in the eastern suburbs, the light rail that goes out through to the east to Kensington, the only time they propose public transport improvements or the privatisation and of the Canterbury Bankstown rail line and the delivery of the metro line, the only time that they propose those public transport improvements is to deliver more intense development. They never, ever deliver public transport to help existing residents. And increasingly now, residents in Sydney are so sceptical of any announcement about public transport. They actually veer away from the prospect of a rail line or a bus line or a light rail service because they know that it's not for them. They know that if the government's talking about providing, this government is talking about providing any element of public transport, what they're actually saying is we're going to bulldoze your suburb, put high-rise around there, and we're going to be providing some kind of token public transport to improve the land values and the sales of the new development. And that, unfortunately, is the truth of planning, and that's what the Greater Sydney Commission is rubber stamping with its proposed Northern District plans. And when you're talking about the B line, and you're talking about public transport, I don't know if many of you are aware of it, but just 2 days ago, the same government, well just yesterday indeed it was, announced that they were privatising the current publicly owned and publicly run inner west bus lines, bus services. It's all been privatised and sold off to a private tender. So if you think that you're going to get publicly owned, publicly run public transport here, I think you're kidding yourself with this current government. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we need to recognise that the Greater Sydney Commission is not a legitimate planning body. It's undemocratic, it's imposing things on us, and we have no say in it. They're actually going through the process of making these draft district plans while you have an unelected administrator in charge of your local council. Now, after pressure from the community, pressure from myself and the Greens, the Greater Sydney Commission have said that they will extend the submission period, the consultation period for the draft district plans that are rewriting your suburbs. They'll extend it until a few months after the upcoming September local government elections. A few months after. So if there is one thing you should be asking all of your candidates in the upcoming September local council election, apart from would you guarantee to vote to reinstate Pittwater, which would be a good starting point, You should be demanding that they've got their head around the Northern District plans and they're ready from day one to make submissions about lowering housing targets until public transport is delivered for existing residents and about protecting your core environmental and social values in the district plans. They need to have their head around it from day one. Day one. And we also need to change our Planning Act. Guess how many times climate change is referenced in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, the core Planning Act, that all of our DAs and strategic plans, LEPs, DCPs, all of the planning instruments and planning decisions are made under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. Guess how many times climate change is mentioned in it? Zero. Not once. Can you imagine the collective willful ignorance of the New South Wales Parliament to be having our core Planning Act, the one that determines whether you get a coal mine approved or a apartment block built or a major transport link delivered, and not include an explicit reference and requirement to deal with climate change? We must change that. We must change the Planning Act so that climate change is one of the, if not the primary consideration in all of those major developments. And that is an obligation we have collectively to ensure our elected representatives do that on our behalf. And the kind of image that Graham was proposing of a development at Ingleside, I almost wanted to approve the development at Ingleside. The idea that we would have a carbon neutral development with major water recycling, with walkable, livable links and public transport links. It shouldn't be a dream. It shouldn't be a dream. That should just be the standard way we do new development in New South Wales. It should absolutely be. And just outside my extraordinarily luxurious parliamentary office, I look across over the top of Old Parliament House from our 1970s office block at the back of Parliament House, and I've been watching as the former, I think it was the former State Bank office tower of 35, 38 stories, which was built 40 years ago, has been demolished. Just taken down, layer after layer after layer, an enormous amount of energy to take it down, a huge amount of embodied energy in the concrete and the built form in that thing. And do you know what? They're going to replace it with another building with almost exactly the same size, I think about 5 stories higher, but they're going to replace it with another building almost identical. What insanity is collectively driving those kind of planning decisions? We've only got one planet, and we can't afford to keep doing that and ignoring the cumulative impact of our development. I can tell you now, does anyone watch what happened with Darling Harbour, built in the 1980s, as a, contested but ultimately successful development? It all got knocked down as disposable commercial development, and it's been replaced with another series of development which is designed to last for 40 years, when it'll be knocked over and replaced again. Remember when we used to build cities to last for centuries? Public buildings that lasted for centuries? We need to remember that we build cities for people, just not of this generation, but of future generations. And we can't afford to keep this disposable approach to our housing and commercial and residential stock if we want to survive in a carbon-constrained environment. We cannot. Which brings me lastly to forced amalgamations. I could not believe that we couldn't save Pittwater. I was shattered when the proclamation was made to destroy Pittwater. But I could see it coming. And indeed, other communities around the state saw what was coming, a government that was not listening and didn't care. And that's why legal proceedings were started in places like Ku-ring-gai, Hunters Hill, and North Sydney, and Wallara, Oberon. And those legal proceedings have been extremely successful in saving their councils. And hats off to all those councils who have actually taken the action, put the money on the table and saved their councils. As a former deputy mayor of Wallara Council, the title I use, I won it in a contested election. It was deadlocked, and it was a very Wallara moment. The decision of whether I would be deputy mayor or somebody else was pulled out of a champagne bucket. Very, very Wallara. But as a former deputy mayor of Wallara, I was very proud to see just recently, when their application for special leave to the High Court was approved, And that council, unified council, and on that council indeed there's a Liberal mayor, there's Green councillor, there's independent councillors, but they have largely, not entirely, but largely stood together and put their politics to one side to protect their local council. And that's a pattern, I think, for community engagement. And that's local government acting as it should, as it absolutely should. And they now have their day in court in the High Court, because the High Court is deeply troubled by a process that sees local councils amalgamated, history destroyed, on the basis of reports, secret reports that neither the community or the council get. And that's what's at issue in the High Court case in Woollahra. And hats off as well to Ku-ring-gai, because they won that case in the Court of Appeal, which really opened the door to Woollahra. I think there is a big question though, and I'll finish with this, about what to do for Pittwater. It would have been terrific had your elected council done what those other councils done, seen the writing on the wall and brought proceedings to protect your council. We would still have Pittwater Council now. And that's a great tragedy. A great tragedy. And there's a lesson there about the reality of power in New South Wales. They won't listen to you unless you have something to actually make them listen to you. And that's what court proceedings do. But the question is, and I think we're going to have a discussion about it, whether or not there is a good basis to commence legal proceedings now that there's been an amalgamated council, now that it's 12 months post-amalgamation, whether you should bring legal proceedings or whether or not you should use other mechanisms to generate the energy to actually overturn the amalgamation. I'm probably of the view that we should use other mechanisms. There is a process, and I'll distribute some copies of a draft petition, where if you get 250 residents or 10% of the former Pittwater area and you get them to sign on to a lawful petition, you can actually petition the minister and demand a public inquiry about the de-amalgamation. That is a great community campaign, I think. By all means, get the legal advice, and I think that would be very prudent, get legal advice about whether or not you can follow the Ku-ring-gai decision and overturn it. But I've got to say, my view about the campaign is this will be a 2-year campaign that will take us through after the next state election. And you need to mobilise your community, tell them that they can achieve it, remind them how good Pittwater is, and after the next state election, have that mobilised community demand the next government to change law. We've got legislation that will do that, to unwind the amalgamation and give you back your local council. Thank you.